Ambassador Krell'ix of the Arcanate Council stood in the observation deck of the Human Rescue Coordination Center, watching in bewilderment as 47 rescue workers, 3 helicopters, 2 emergency medical teams, and what appeared to be half the population of a small town mobilized to search for one missing child in a vast wilderness. And he turned to his human liaison, Dr. Sarah Chen, and asked the question that had been troubling him since arriving on Earth 3 months ago. Why do you humans commit such extraordinary resources, such overwhelming force, such what you call overkill for a single individual when logic dictates that the mathematical probability of success doesn't justify the resource expenditure? Why do you refuse to calculate acceptable losses like every other species in the galaxy? Sarah looked at the elderly alien with his 4 eyes and rational expression, and she smiled sadly and said, "Because, Ambassador, what you call overkill, we call love. And what you call acceptable losses, we call unacceptable. And if you want to understand humanity, if you want to understand why we fight the way we fight and care the way we care and refuse to give up the way we refuse to give up, then watch what happens here today. Watch us find that little girl, and maybe you'll finally understand what makes humans different." The missing child was Emma Rodriguez, age 7, who'd wandered away from a family camping trip 18 hours ago in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. And the search had grown from the initial panicked family calling for help to this massive coordinated effort that seemed, to Krell'ix's logical mind, completely disproportionate to the situation, inefficient, wasteful of resources that could be used for the collective good. And yet every human involved acted like this single child's life was worth moving mountains, worth exhausting themselves, worth spending whatever it took in money and time and effort. And Krell'ix found this fascinating and incomprehensible in equal measure. Krell'ix had come to Earth as part of the Arcanate's evaluation of humanity's petition to join the Galactic Council, and he'd been assigned to study human culture, human values, human decision-making processes, and in 3 months he'd documented extensive evidence of what his species considered fundamental irrationality: humans who bankrupted themselves paying for medical care for elderly relatives who would die soon anyway, humans who risked their lives running into burning buildings to save strangers, humans who adopted damaged children from war zones and spent years helping them heal when selecting healthy offspring would be more efficient, humans who built elaborate memorials to individual dead rather than simply moving on, humans who, in every measurable way, seemed to value individual lives over collective optimization. And Krell'ix had been preparing a report recommending against human admission to the Council because a species that couldn't make rational cost-benefit analyses about resource allocation seemed dangerous, seemed unstable, seemed like they'd disrupt the careful logical systems the galaxy had built. But Sarah had asked him to wait to observe this rescue operation, to try to understand before condemning. Sarah explained as they watched the Coordination Center's activities that Emma Rodriguez wasn't special in any measurable way. She wasn't a genetic prodigy or a leader's child or someone whose survival had strategic importance. She was just a regular 7-year-old who liked drawing horses and playing with her dog, and who'd gotten scared and run the wrong direction when she'd heard a loud noise. Just an ordinary child lost in the woods, and yet the response was extraordinary, with volunteers driving from hundreds of miles away, with professional search and rescue teams deploying expensive equipment, with the local community organizing food and shelter for searchers, with businesses donating supplies, with strangers coordinating on social media, all for one ordinary little girl who most of these people had never met and would never meet again. And Krell'ix asked, "But why? What is the return on this investment? What do these humans gain from exhausting themselves for a stranger's child?" And Sarah had looked at him with an expression he was learning to recognize as pity mixed with patience and said, "They gain the chance to be human, Ambassador. They gain the opportunity to be the kind of people who don't calculate whether a child's life is worth saving, who don't weigh costs against benefits when someone needs help, who don't accept that some losses are acceptable, and that's worth everything to us." The search continued through the day, with teams systematically covering grid sections, with volunteers calling Emma's name until their voices went hoarse, with Emma's parents Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, stationed at the command center looking exhausted and terrified and holding on to each other and on to hope, and Krell'ix observed the way other humans treated them, the way strangers brought them food and coffee, the way rescue workers stopped to update them personally rather than just filing reports, the way the community surrounded them with support. And he noted in his datapad that humans seemed to engage in extensive emotional labor that served no practical purpose, since comfort didn't increase the probability of finding the child. And yet Sarah, reading over his shoulder, said gently, "It serves a very practical purpose, Ambassador. It reminds Maria and Carlos that they're not alone, that their community cares, that their daughter matters to more than just them, and that hope is shared, and yes, that doesn't show up in your efficiency calculations. But it matters more than efficiency. It matters more than logic. It matters because we're not just trying to find a body. We're trying to bring a child home to parents who love her, and that's sacred to us. That's worth whatever it costs." As evening approached and the search entered its second night, Krell'ix noticed something he found remarkable. Instead of exhaustion leading to withdrawal, as would be logical, more volunteers arrived, people who'd worked full shifts at their jobs and then drove to the search area to help. People who brought their own supplies because they didn't want to burden the operation. People who had no connection to the Rodriguez family except shared humanity, and one volunteer, an elderly man named Robert who'd been searching for 12 straight hours, told Krell'ix when asked why he was still going, "Because I have a granddaughter about Emma's age, and I can't imagine what her parents are going through. And if it was my granddaughter out there, I'd want someone to keep looking, to not give up, to treat her like she mattered more than tired feet or rational resource allocation. So I keep looking because that's what humans do. We show up for each other, especially when it's hard, especially when the math doesn't add up, especially when logic says to quit. Because we're not purely logical beings, we're beings who love, and love doesn't calculate costs." Krell'ix found himself thinking about his own species, about the Arcanate's proud history of rational governance, about the way they'd achieved galactic success through careful optimization and logical decision-making, about how they'd eliminated emotional decision-making from policy and how this had made them prosperous and stable, and he realized, watching these humans search desperately for a child they didn't know, that the Arcanate had also eliminated something else, something he didn't have a word for in his language but that humans called heart. And he wondered if perhaps efficiency wasn't the highest virtue, if perhaps there were things worth being inefficient for, worth being illogical for, worth committing what he'd called overkill for. The breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m. on the second night, when a search dog named Max alerted in a ravine 2 miles from where Emma had last been seen, and the team found her wedged in a small cave, scared and cold and dehydrated but alive, and Krell'ix watched on the command center. Monitors as the rescue worker, a woman named Jennifer who'd been searching for 36 hours straight, reached Emma and immediately wrapped her in a thermal blanket and held her and said, "You're safe now. Sweetheart, we've got you. Your mom and dad are waiting for you. You're going home." And Emma, who'd been trying to be brave, started crying and said, "I'm sorry I got lost. I'm sorry everyone had to look for me." And Jennifer, also crying, said, "Oh, honey, no. Don't be sorry. We're just so happy we found you. You're worth every second. You're worth everything." And Krell'ix felt something strange happening in his primary circulatory system, something that the Arcanate had bred out of their species generations ago, but that humans apparently still experienced, something that made his vision blur and his breathing irregular, something humans would have recognized immediately as emotion, as tears, as the physical response to witnessing something profoundly moving. The reunion between Emma and her parents was broadcast to the command center, and Krell'ix watched as Maria and Carlos ran to their daughter, as they held her and checked her for injuries and kissed her face and told her over and over that they loved her. And he watched as the rescue workers, these people who'd spent 2 days in the wilderness searching, stood back and smiled and cried and hugged each other, not because they were receiving payment or recognition or anything tangible, but simply because they'd succeeded in bringing a child home, in making sure that Emma Rodriguez would grow up, would draw more horses, would play with her dog, would have a life. And the celebration wasn't about them. It was about her. about this one ordinary, extraordinary little girl who mattered enough for 47 people to search for 2 days, and Krell'ix understood suddenly that this was overkill only if you measured it in resources expended. But if you measured it in value created, in hope sustained, in love demonstrated, in community strengthened, in the message sent to every parent and every child that individual lives matter more than efficiency, then it wasn't overkill at all. It was exactly right. It was perfectly proportioned. It was the only logical response if you understood that humans didn't calculate the value of life in resource expenditure, but in something deeper, something that transcended mathematics. Sarah found Krell'ix standing alone in the corner of the command center, his 4 eyes all producing the liquid secretion that humans called tears, and she didn't say anything, just stood beside him and watched as the rescue workers packed up their equipment, as volunteers hugged and exchanged contact information, as Maria and Carlos Rodriguez thanked everyone who'd helped, their voices breaking with emotion. And finally, Krell'ix said, "I have been wrong, Dr. Chen. I have been fundamentally wrong about humanity. I thought your refusal to calculate acceptable losses was weakness, was dangerous irrationality, was evidence that you weren't ready for galactic civilization. But I understand now that it's the opposite. It's your greatest strength. It's what makes you more civilized than species that pride themselves on pure logic. Because you understand something we forgot. You understand that civilization isn't about efficiency or optimization. It's about deciding that every individual matters, that no one is expendable, that we commit whatever resources necessary because that's what it means to be human, to be civilized, to be worthy of calling ourselves advanced. And what I called overkill is actually the minimum required response when a child needs help. When anyone needs help, and I am humbled, Dr. Chen, I am changed by what I've witnessed here." Sarah smiled and said, "Ambassador, I'm going to tell you something that might help your report to the Arcanate, something about how humans approach problems, and why we do what you call overkill," and she gestured to the rescue operation. "When we face a challenge, when someone needs help, when a problem needs solving, our first instinct isn't to calculate the minimum necessary response. It's to ask, what's the maximum we can do? It's to bring everything we have, to commit fully, to refuse to accept that limitation should stop us from trying, and yes, sometimes that means we use 3 helicopters when 1 might have worked. We deploy 47 searchers when 20 might have been sufficient. We spend resources that seem disproportionate to the immediate problem. But, Ambassador, we do it because we know something your species has forgotten. We know that how we respond to individual need defines who we are collectively. We know that the child we save today might grow up to cure a disease or write a symphony or simply live a good, quiet life, loving her family. And we don't need to know which it will be. We don't need to calculate her future value. We just need to know she's a child who's lost and scared and who deserves to be found. And that's enough. That's sufficient justification for maximum effort. For what you call overkill and ambassador, this applies to everything we do, every challenge we face, every person we help. We bring our full force, our full compassion, our full commitment, because we learned a long time ago that half measures fail, that minimum efforts fall short, that when you really care about something, when something really matters, you don't hold back. You don't calculate the minimum necessary. You ask what's the maximum possible, and you do that. And if we have to choose between being efficient and being thorough, between being logical and being loving, between calculating acceptable losses and refusing to accept any losses, we choose the latter every time, because that's what makes us human. Krell'ix absorbed this, his sophisticated mind processing the implications, and he asked, "But Dr. Chen, doesn't this approach sometimes fail? Doesn't committing maximum resources to individual problems sometimes mean you can't help as many people overall? Doesn't your refusal to accept acceptable losses sometimes create greater losses?" And Sarah nodded and said, "Yes, sometimes. In pure mathematical terms, our approach is less optimal than calculated triage would be, but Ambassador, we've learned something through thousands of years of civilization. We've learned that societies that calculate who's worth saving and who isn't, that decide some people are acceptable losses, that ration compassion based on efficiency. Those societies stop being worth saving themselves. They lose something essential, something that makes life worth living. And we've decided, collectively as a species, that we'd rather be inefficient and humane than efficient and cold. We'd rather commit overkill on compassion than calculate the minimum necessary caring. We'd rather exhaust ourselves saving one child than efficiently save 10 children while accepting that 5 others die. Because the way we treat that one child, the effort we expend, the refusal to give up, that sends a message to everyone in our society that they matter, that if they ever need help, we'll bring everything we have, that no one is expendable. And that message, that promise, that social contract, it creates a kind of civilization that's worth being part of, worth fighting for, worth preserving. The following weeks saw a transformation in Ambassador Krell'ix that surprised everyone who knew him, as he began spending more time observing not just human efficiency metrics, but human heart. Visiting hospitals where he watched medical teams fight for hours to save single patients who logically had low survival probability, attending community fundraisers where people donated money to help neighbors they'd never met, observing volunteer organizations where humans gave their time freely to help others with no expectation of return. And everywhere he went, he saw the same pattern. Humans committing what seemed like excessive resources, overwhelming force, overkill, to problems that could theoretically be solved with less, but choosing not to solve them with less. Choosing instead to bring everything they had because the problem mattered and the people affected mattered and the message sent mattered. And slowly, Krell'ix began to understand that this wasn't irrationality, it was a different kind of rationality, one that calculated costs not just in resources but in dignity, in hope, in the kind of society you built by how you treated people when they were most vulnerable. He attended Emma Rodriguez's welcome home party, held by the community 2 weeks after her rescue, and he watched as search volunteers and the Rodriguez family and neighbors and strangers who'd followed the story all came together to celebrate. And Emma, wearing a t-shirt that said "Never Give Up," that one of the rescue workers had given her, ran around playing with other children, completely unaware that her survival had required what the Arcanate would consider massive resource inefficiency, completely unaware that her life had been valued by her community at a level that transcended calculation. And Krell'ix asked Carlos Rodriguez, "Did you know before your daughter was lost? Did you know that so many strangers would come to help?" And Carlos, his eyes still getting emotional when he talked about it, said, "I hoped, Ambassador, I hoped because I'd seen it happen for other families. I'd seen our community show up for people in crisis, and I'd even helped search for a missing hiker once years ago, but experiencing it, seeing that many people care about my daughter, about my family, that many people refuse to give up, it changed me. It made me understand what it means to be human, what it means to be part of a community that doesn't calculate whether you're worth saving, but just commits to saving you. And, Ambassador, I've already signed up to be a volunteer search and rescue worker because I want to be that person for someone else. I want to be part of that overwhelming response, that overkill of caring for the next family that needs it." Krell'ix returned to his quarters and wrote his report to the Arcanate Council. And instead of recommending against human admission to the Galactic Council as he'd planned, he wrote something that would shock his superiors and ultimately change the Arcanate's understanding of civilization. He wrote, "This evaluator has completed 3 months of a study on the human species and has reached conclusions that contradict initial assessments and that contradict Arcanate conventional wisdom about the nature of advanced civilization. I have observed that humans engage in what appears to be massive inefficiency, committing excessive resources to individual problems, refusing to calculate acceptable losses, demonstrating what they call overkill, in response to challenges that could theoretically be addressed with minimum necessary force. However, I have concluded that this apparent irrationality is actually a sophisticated form of rationality that the Arcanate has lost. Humans understand that how a society responds to individual need defines that society's character, that the willingness to commit maximum effort for individuals creates a collective that is stronger, more resilient, more innovative, and more worthy of preservation than societies that optimize purely for efficiency. I have witnessed a search operation where 47 rescue workers spent 2 days searching for one lost child, an expenditure that by Arcanate standards would be considered wasteful. but I have also witnessed the effects of that search, a community strengthened, trust in social institutions reinforced, a message sent to every family that their children matter, volunteers inspired to help others, and most importantly, a child saved who deserved to be saved not because of calculated future value, but because her life has inherent worth. I recommend not only that humans be admitted to the Galactic Council, but that the Council consider learning from human approaches to civilization, that we reconsider our own optimization-focused policies, that we examine whether our efficiency has cost us something essential. I believe the galaxy would benefit from what humans call overkill, from the commitment of maximum resources to individual problems, from the refusal to accept that any loss is acceptable, from the understanding that how we treat the most vulnerable among us defines our worth as civilizations. Humanity is ready for the stars not despite their apparent irrationality, but because of it, because they understand something we have forgotten, and we need them to remind us what it means to be truly civilized. The response from the Arcanate was mixed, with some counselors dismissing Krell'ix's report as evidence he'd been emotionally compromised by human contact, but others found themselves intrigued, found themselves questioning assumptions they'd held for generations, found themselves wondering if perhaps the cold logic that had made them successful had also made them empty. And a delegation was sent to Earth to verify Krell'ix's observations, to study human society themselves, and they too witnessed the overkill, the overwhelming response to individual need, the refusal to calculate who was worth saving, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to understand. Sarah Chen was invited to address the full Galactic Council, to explain human philosophy regarding resource allocation and individual value, and she stood before representatives of 100 species and said, "Honored delegates, you call it overkill when we commit everything we have to saving one person, to helping one community. To solving one problem, you call it inefficient. You call it wasteful. You call it irrational. But I want to suggest an alternative interpretation. What if what you call overkill is actually the minimum acceptable response to human need? What if the problem isn't that we commit too much, but that you've forgotten how to commit enough? What if true civilization isn't measured by how efficiently you allocate resources, but by how thoroughly you refuse to give up on individuals? And I'm not suggesting you abandon all efficiency. I'm not saying logic has no place. I'm saying that when you're deciding whether a person lives or dies, whether a community gets help or doesn't, whether someone lost gets found or gets abandoned, in those moments, efficiency should not be the determining factor. Commitment should be, love should be. The refusal to accept that anyone is expendable should be. Because the societies you build by treating individuals as calculations are societies that optimize for resources at the cost of souls. And we humans, we've made mistakes. We've had dark periods where we forgot this, where we did calculate acceptable losses, where we did decide some people were expendable, and those periods are our greatest shames, our deepest regrets, and we've learned, through pain and through error, that the only way to build a civilization worth having is to commit to the principle that everyone matters, that no one is acceptable collateral, that when someone needs help, you don't calculate the minimum necessary response. You bring everything you have, you bring overkill, because that person is a universe unto themselves. They contain multitudes, they matter infinitely, and how we respond to them when they're vulnerable defines who we are when we're strong. The human petition for Galactic Council membership was approved, and more significantly, the Council established what became known as the Rodriguez Protocols, named after the little girl whose rescue had sparked a galaxy-wide conversation about values and civilization. Protocols that required Council member species to commit maximum rather than minimum resources to rescue operations, to humanitarian crises, to individual emergency responses. And while the protocols were controversial and some species argued they were inefficient, the galaxy slowly began to change, began to embrace what humans called overkill, and what they were learning to call appropriate response. And Krell'ix, who'd been transformed by watching humans search for a child, became one of the protocol's strongest advocates, traveling to different worlds explaining what he'd learned, teaching other species that efficiency without compassion is just another form of barbarism, that true advancement isn't measured in resource optimization, but in refusal to abandon anyone, That what humans call overkill the galaxy should call sufficient, should call necessary, should call the baseline for any civilization that wants to call itself civilized. Years later, Emma Rodriguez, now a young woman studying to become a doctor, attended an anniversary ceremony marking the adoption of the Rodriguez Protocols, and she stood before a gathering that included Ambassador Krell'ix, now elderly even by Arcanate standards, and she said, "I was 7 years old when I got lost in the woods, and I was so scared, and I kept hearing people calling my name, kept hearing them refuse to give up. And I remember thinking that I must matter a lot for so many people to look for me. And that thought, that knowledge that I mattered, it shaped everything that came after. It made me want to be worthy of that effort, to be the kind of person who shows up for others the way others showed up for me." And I learned later that Ambassador Krell'ix had called the rescue operation Overkill, had questioned whether I was worth 47 people searching for 2 days. And I'm not offended by that question. I'm grateful for it, because it led to a conversation that changed the galaxy, that led to protocols that have saved millions of lives, that led to a fundamental shift in how we think about individual value. And Ambassador, I want to thank you for being willing to question your assumptions, for being willing to learn, for being willing to understand that what looks like overkill from outside looks like love from inside, and for helping spread that understanding across the stars. Krell'ix, his 4 eyes still capable of producing tears after all these years of learning from humans, responded, "Ms. Rodriguez, I came to Earth believing that logic and efficiency were the highest values. That civilization meant optimizing resource allocation, that accepting some losses was necessary for the greater good. But watching 47 humans search for you, watching your community refuse to give up, watching your rescue and reunion with your parents, I learned that I had been profoundly wrong. I learned that civilization isn't about efficiency. It's about deciding that everyone matters enough to bring everything we have. It's about refusing to calculate who's expendable. It's about understanding that the way we treat one lost child defines our worth as societies. And Emma, you were right to think you mattered. You matter more than any calculation can measure. And every child matters that much. Every person matters that much. And the galaxy is better because humans taught us to respond to need, not with minimum necessary force, but with maximum possible care, not with calculated efficiency, but with overkill of compassion. And I am grateful every day that I was the one sent to evaluate humanity, that I was the one who got to learn this lesson, that I was the one who got to witness what happens when a species refuses to accept that anyone is acceptably lost. And I have spent the remainder of my life trying to spread that lesson, trying to help other species understand what I learned watching humans search for you, that civilization is measured not by how efficiently we succeed, but by how thoroughly we refuse to accept failure when a life is at stake, and that what humans call overkill, we should all call the minimum acceptable response when someone needs help, when someone is lost, when someone matters, which is to say, always, because everyone always matters, and that truth, that simple, profound truth, is humanity's gift to the galaxy, is what makes them not just ready for the stars, but essential to them, is what transforms the cold, calculated universe into something warmer, something kinder, something worth being part of. And Emma, I want you to know that every time the Rodriguez protocols save a life, every time a species commits overkill of compassion because these protocols require it, I think of that night when we found you, when I watched humans refuse to give up, and I am reminded that sometimes the most logical thing we can do is to be thoroughly, completely, excessively illogical, to commit everything we have because a child is lost, because a person needs help, because that's what it means to be civilized, to be human, to be worthy of the vast, beautiful universe we inhabit.